My name is Donnise Hurley, and I'm a senior geographic analyst in the population division at the Department of City Planning. Thank you for joining me as I dive into a critical piece of New York City's demographic puzzle. So I'm excited to share a sneak peek of Chapter 5 in the soon-to-be-published 6th edition of the Newest New Yorkers, the flagship publication of the Population Division. Building on a series dating back to 1992, the latest edition offers a comprehensive portrait of the city's foreign-born population, from lawful entry paths to social economic impacts. The 2026 volume introduces more dynamic experience through an interactive HTML format I engineered to allow direct engagement with content. This technical upgrade ensures that readers can more effectively navigate the complex data and trends that continue to reshape New York City. This book will be published later this year and will be available on the Population Division's website and to purchase at the city bookstore. In the 2010s, nearly 1 million new immigrants arrived in New York City. This presentation explores the how behind that flow to uncover the lawful pathways that create the city's unique population. While today's conversation focuses on immigration, I want to give a quick shout out to an OTI Beta Bagel happening later this year with the Mayor's Office for People with Disabilities. This event will highlight another vital layer of our demographic landscape, the need for American Sign Language data and improved data on the population with disabilities. Both efforts are about moving beyond broad numbers to ensure every New Yorker is visible to our city's infrastructure. You may be wondering why examine admission pathways. It is because U.S. immigration law isn't just a set of rules. It's a filter. It determines the size, the characteristics, and the long-term trajectory of our population. Whether someone arrives as a high-tech recruit, a green card lottery winner, or a sponsored spouse, who arrives fundamentally shapes the social and economic fabric of the city. By understanding these paths, we gain a blueprint for New York's future. For example, data tell us which languages to prioritize for essential services and how to maintain global talent pipeline that keeps New York's economy strong. During our time together, I will give you a little background on immigration law, the classes of admissions that determine how a foreign national is eligible to enter or remain in the U.S. We will look at how the 2010s marked a massive shift where old migration patterns cooled and new global corridors opened. By the end, you'll see just how these administrative codes have a direct impact on the city's demographic landscape. But before we begin, I will clarify a vital technical distinction: the difference between DHS administrative data on green card recipients, which is the focus of this presentation, and the American Community Survey, which tracks actual residents on the ground. The ACS serves as the primary source for nearly every chapter in the Newest New Yorkers. In contrast, Chapter 5 draws from administrative data from the Department of Homeland Security on newly admitted immigrants to the city, as well as their country of birth and paths of admission. The administrative lens of the LPR data and the residential lens of ACS data tell different parts of the immigration story. Using a library analogy, think of LPR data as the invoice received with a shipment of books. It says 1,000 new books were delivered to a branch in Jamaica, Queens this year. The invoice only records the point of entry. It doesn't track if those books remained or moved to other branches. Just like an invoice, LPR data acts as a formal legal record. It tracks the moment someone is granted a green card. Because it relies on visa applications, it records where a person intended to live at the time they applied. Like all administrative data, it is subject to limitations. For example, administrative processing delays can cause annual numbers to fluctuate. So we often use we often group these data into 10-year periods to see true underlying trends. In the newest New Yorkers, we look at data from a 40-year period from 1982 to 2021, which were grouped by decades of 1980s, 1990s, and so forth. You could say the data spans from millennials to Gen Alpha. The second limitation is the data struggles to capture real-time status changes, such as when people move from asylee to permanent resident to citizen. U.S. asylum filings in recent years, but do not show up in large numbers in OHSS data for the city due to this lag. This is in part due to a change in how DHS disseminates data below the state level. LPR totals for New York City are derived from county-level data. This means that unlike state and national totals, which are eventually updated to reflect processing backlogs, at county-level data remains a static snapshot that may undercount the resident refugee population due to a lack of retroactive revisions. ACS data, in contrast, is like an annual inventory of books currently on the shelf at the library. You might find that only 700 of those new books are still on Jamaica's shelves. The other 300 have moved to different branches. Some books came through alternate channels, such as community donations, interlibrary loans, or permanent archives, as well as overdue books that were put back on the shelf. As an annual survey, ACS data offers a residential lens of who actually is here. The ACS is just one of the data products produced by the Census Bureau. It is a massive ongoing effort that goes far beyond a simple head count. While DHS data tells us who was admitted and by which means, the ACS tell us the characteristics of the population. By surveying 3.5 million households every year, the Bureau captures thousands of variables from what languages you speak to housing costs, all of which can be cross-tabulated by place of birth. Because this is a survey and not a full count, it is naturally subject to sampling error. The Census Bureau includes a margin of error for each metric to allow us to distinguish between true demographic shifts and simple sampling error. In summary, we use LPR data to understand the lawful pathways and policy shifts. It gives us the how and the why, the specific pathways people use to enter the country. In contrast, we use ACS data to understand the social economic characteristics of the population. Now let's talk about U.S. immigration law. U.S. immigration law, in a way, acts like a prism, refracting the flow of immigration through paths of admission. The landmark Immigration and Nationality Act of 1965 came on the heels of the Civil Rights Act. The new law made immigration more equitable, dismantling discriminatory system, such as which was reported on in the 1921 New York Times article here. And that old system privileged Northern and Western Europe. It was replaced with a more equitable framework for all countries. The 1965 Act, which remains the basis of the current immigration system, had classes of admissions that prioritized family reunification, skills needed for the U.S. economy, and the admissions of refugees and asylees. The 1990 Immigration Act expanded employment-based visas and established a permanent diversity category, creating the 4 primary legal tracks of family, employment, diversity, and humanitarian. These admission pathways are still active today. The law doesn't just let people in. It refines and redirects them, ultimately shaping our demographic landscape in the same way refracted light that passes through the atmosphere colors our physical landscape. Before we look at who's coming to the city, let's look at the pathways defined by the law. Because immigration law defines the categories people must pass through to get a green card. It acts like a prism. This diagram visualizes how the flow of immigration gets refracted into multiple pathways. As mentioned earlier, the 1990 Act established 5 major classes of admission: family, immediate relatives of U.S., which are both considered family-related admission pathways, as well as employment, diversity, and humanitarian. Family reunification is the cornerstone of U.S. immigration policy, and it's comprised of family preferences and immediate relatives. Family preferences are for more distant relatives, such as adult children and siblings of citizens or spouses and children of existing green card holders. These are subject to a worldwide limit of at least 226,000 per year. The immediate relative category includes spouses, unmarried minor children, and parents of U.S. citizens. Crucially, there are no numerical limits on these visas. Once an immigrant naturalizes, they can sponsor family members through the unlimited immediate relative path rather than the capped preference path, thereby speeding up the process for their families. The employment category is designed to bring in workers with extraordinary abilities, advanced degrees, or those filling critical labor shortages. The 1990 Act prioritized skills that would give the U.S. a competitive edge in the global market. In response to appeals from employers, the number of employment-based visas increased from 54,000 to 140,000, which most of these visas reserved for persons of exceptional skills and their families. The number of visas for less skilled was reduced to just 10,000. And that's a part of the third employment preference category. The diversity visa program, as we know it today, actually began as a temporary measure to address the unintended consequences of earlier laws. In the early 1990s, the 1990 Act launched a transitional lottery that awarded 40,000 visas annually. A significant 40% of those visas were reserved for Ireland, a country considered adversely affected by the 1965 Act, which had ended the old quota system favoring Europeans. By 1995, a permanent visa lottery was enacted, making 50,000 visas available each fiscal year to nationals from countries that did not send more than 50,000 immigrants to the U.S. over the previous 5 years. To ensure no single nation dominated the lottery, a 7% per country limit is applied to the total pool, therefore maintaining a broad geographic spread across the globe. The Refugee Act of 1980 defines a refugee as a person with a well-founded fear of persecution on account of race, religion, nationality, membership in a particular social group, or political opinion. Refugees are processed abroad, while asylees apply from within the U.S. or at a port of entry. As mentioned earlier, refugees and asylees only show up in LPR data when they adjust their status to a green card, which usually happens at least 1 year after they were granted humanitarian status. The U.S. president sets an annual limit on the number of refugees who can be admitted to the U.S. In 2026, that limit was capped to an all-time low of 7,500. Granting refugee status is complementary to U.S. foreign policy objectives, making admissions in this category a political decision as much as a humanitarian one. And there are no limits to asylees, but it can be paused, not allowing people to come in. Okay, so these two figures show the share of immigrants entering under each class of admission for New York City here on the left and the U.S. on the right. New York City follows a unique class of admissions profile that has been historically built on deep-rooted family connections. So you can see here in the 80s, the bottom two categories are family related, and compared to for the US. So 57 came in on immediate relatives. I'm sorry, for family preferences, and then immediate relatives for 24%. So 82% of immigrants arrived on family-related visas in the 1980s, but while family ties remain the bedrock of LPR status, the traditional map is shifting. We're seeing a notable cool down of flows from our historic dominant sources of countries due to the introduction of new paths, such as diversity visas. So that share by the 2010s has declined to 77%, but it's still higher than the US at 65%. The 1990s Act also increased emphasis on entry of employment. So that was reflected in a 57% growth in employment visas used by immigrants, and that's shown in the yellow. However, when compared to the US, the city receives a lower proportion of immigrants arriving with an employment visa, a pattern that has been true for most decades. In the most recent period, in the 2010s, only 8% of immigrants to the city arrived on an employment visa, compared to 15% for the US. As with LPRs entering unemployment visas, the city receives few refugees and asylees, 8% for the city versus 13% for the US, and that's shown in the magenta. In contrast, when we look at the blue for diversity visas, the city receives slightly more than the US overall at 6% versus 4%. The remainder of this presentation will focus on how the city's largest sources of LPRs have navigated these pathways. This chart shows how over the last 4 decades, the composition of the city's immigrant population reflects the changes in federal immigration pathways. For example, family reunification provisions have facilitated a consistent growth in the number of LPRs arriving from the Dominican Republic, making it the largest sources of LPRs in every period, except for the 2000s, when it was second. As diversity pathways were modified in the 1990s and 2000s, we see a corresponding increase in the population from Bangladesh, Uzbekistan, and Ghana. And we see the impact of the fluctuating humanitarian visas. Okay, so we see the impact of the fluctuating humanitarian pathways on countries such as China. In the 2000s, growth in the Chinese immigrant population was driven by high volume of refugee admissions. The number of Chinese refugees settling in the city in the 2010s fell by 24,000 compared to the previous decade, accounting for 40% of an overall decline in the city's refugee population. Likewise, changes in the economic preferences had an effect on immigration from Korea, the Philippines, India, and Mexico. In the 2010s, 1/2 of Koreans and nearly 1/3 of Filipinos and over 1/5 of Indians arrived on an employment visa. These changes in the top groups over time show that the city is in a state of constant ebb and flow. One generation's path of entry paves the way for the next. The fact that 40% of the top groups in 1980s were that only for 40% of the top groups are new since the 1980s is the ultimate evidence of this demographic shift. Okay, so in the last section, we'll unpack this chart and see just how the largest immigrant groups to the city navigate paths made available by U.S. immigration law. So these three charts show the three of the largest sources of immigrants who predominantly entered on family-based visas. The Dominican Republic stood out with 90% of its immigrants entering through this category, a share that has changed very little since the 1980s. Over 90% of immigrants from Jamaica also entered on this category. In the 1980s, almost one half of immigrants from Bangladesh entered on diversity visas. So you can see that in the top blue and on the far left. Since reaching the 50,000 immigrant threshold over a 5-year period, Bangladesh has been ineligible for diversity visas since 2012. While this path closed, immigration from Bangladesh continued as the population transitioned to a different visa category. By the 2010s, many were eligible to bring in their families using the much larger pool of family-sponsored visas, which accounted for 90% of Bangladeshi flows to the city. Bangladesh illustrates how through participating in the diversity visa program, a group that has initially lacked extensive U.S. ties can establish a community in the city, which then grows through the sponsorship of eligible family members. Some groups experience a decrease in new arrivals to the city. The number of LPRs from Trinidad and Tobago declined by half between 2000 and 2010, continuing a long-term trend. Trinidad is now the 14th largest source country, down from 9th. The flow of LPRs admitted from Guyana dropped by over 1/3, and those of Pakistan fell by 1/7. Despite these above-average declines, each of these countries remain among the top 20 groups in the city. In the 2010s, over 70% of immigrants from Uzbekistan entered with a diversity visa, the highest share of any country. It helped Uzbekistan emerge as one of the top 10 source countries of LPRs. Diversity visas also accounted for a large share of Egyptian LPRs. As we saw with Bangladesh, the diversity visa is our best tool for foresight. It allows us to see new communities establishing themselves before they appear in the census. So with Bangladesh, it appeared in LPR data long before it appeared in the top groups for the city in the ACS. The employment-based category saw a very different set of beneficiaries. Although just 8% of all immigrants to the city in the 2010s arrived with an employment visa, this pathway was used by 1/2 of Koreans, exceeding the citywide average across 4 decades. 16% of Mexican immigrants also arrived with an employment visa. While immigrants from mainland China primarily entered as refugees, 38% of Taiwan and 21% from Hong Kong, which is not shown in the chart, also entered on employment visas. Now we look at a pipeline of the future. These are countries that are currently seeing a surge in their population in the city. Flows from Yemen were up by 66%, the highest increase among the major sources of immigration. Immigration from Ghana is also likely to increase. It was the 52nd largest group in New York City in the 1980s and moved to the 20th in the 1990s and is now the 16th largest based on LPR data. In the 1990s, large refugee flows accounted for 80% of immigrants from Ukraine. Over the next 2 decades, refugee flows diminished, while Ukrainians entered as immediate relatives sharply increased during this period. it was inefficient to compensate for the huge decrease in refugee admissions, and the population declined. Similarly, refugee flows from China declined by one half during the past decade. Nonetheless, China remains the second largest country births for LPRs in the 2010s. So just to summarize, New York City welcomed nearly 1 million new permanent residents during the 2010s, accounting for 10% of all U.S. admissions, despite a 7.5% decline from the previous decade. While the city is uniquely reliant on family reunification for 3/4 of its immigrant flow, the city sees a lower share of employment and humanitarian admissions compared to the national average. The biggest takeaway point is the role of U.S. immigration law and the insight gained from analyzing classes of admissions. The law acts as a prism refracting the flow of new immigrants into distinct pathways, where the creating or constraining of these channels determine which colors of the admission spectrum define the city's immigrant landscape. It will leave you with a small glimpse at a potential future patterns. Recent data confirms that the 2010 trends are maintained. While single-year data can be skewed by administrative delays, 2023 suggests that our 2010 analyses remained intact, with Bangladesh and Jamaica remaining the third and fourth largest. Dominican and Chinese flows they fluctuate between being the top two groups, and flows from Uzbekistan and Mexico continue to rise. However, the fiscal year 2026 refugee cap represents a 94% drop, and it signals a new trajectory, likely reducing future flows from countries such as China, which have historically relied on humanitarian pathways. Ultimately, these data show us that there's no single immigrant experience in New York City. Some grew through family ties, while others through the diversity program. But it's the law that shapes the path every immigrant to the city takes. By understanding the lawful gateways used by the newest New Yorkers, we gain a direct window into which global regions will shape our city's next era. Thank you for joining me for the sneak peek of Chapter 6. As I mentioned earlier, the full publication will be released later this year as an interactive version on our website, and a print version available at the city bookstore. In the meantime, you can visit the Population Division's website or our other data products, and follow us on social media for the latest updates and data releases. And of course, feel free to contact me if you have any questions.
I see Andrea had a question. How often is this data collected, and how soon is it made available? They're especially interested in the current trends and how they correlate to the increase in anti-immigration legislation and law enforcement.
So thank you for that question. The data is collected by DHS immediately, so they have quarterly updates. It depends on what level of geography that you're looking at to determine when you'll get the data. There has been a delay in recent years with DHS publishing the data. They've shifted focus from providing us data on LPR. It used to be released annually on the state and national level. If you want to see data below the state level, there's been delays, sometimes up to 2 to 3 years. The most recent data that we have for New York City, which is an aggregate of county level data, that's from 2023. So we're 3 years out. The OHSS works really hard to give us the data, but they have competing priorities, making it difficult to see data below a state level. If you go to DHS's website, they have the national totals up, but it's usually when it's released to the public, there's a year or two delay. And that delay has been increasing as reporting has been shifted to other channels, such as law enforcement, instead of reporting on LPRs. And I can go back to give you the link to DHS's website of where I actually get the data. I can send the direct path later, but it's on the data that I use for the Newest New Yorkers comes from the LPR by state and county and country, and it's for the top 200 counties in the country. They have other data based on different levels, but yeah, you're not going to get real-time data.
We have another question from Mahana from DOHMH, who asks, are there timestamp markers on administrative data that could be applied to understand temporal dynamics of queue time or visa wait time and how that differs by status type or country of origin?
So that's not in the LPR data set. There are other data sets put out by DHS, but the LPR data only looks at the classes of admission and country of birth. They do have some profiles based on characteristics that's only available for metro regions, state, and national, but nothing related to queue times. I think there's another federal agency that looks at the visa processing side, but that's not a part of the LPR data.
And another question from Brendan, who asks, did the Newest New Yorkers publication only begin in the 1990s? And if so, did New York City do data analysis on immigration pathways before that?
Yes, so the book began in the 1990s. It looked at not just immigration pathways, but it was a profile of the foreign-born population in New York City. We have various reports on our website, but nothing earlier than that, looking at the foreign-born population and classes of admission. But there have been other papers by our previous director and deputy director. So they have peer-reviewed papers looking at these trends over time. And some of them are before the 90s.
Those are all the questions in the chat so far, but if anyone has any additional questions and they want to put them in there, or if they want to come off mute and ask, welcome to. Oh, I see Andrea has another question. Are the numbers from the various sources cross-checked for accuracy? Do you know who sponsors data collection from each organization?
I'm not quite sure I understand the question. LPR data is administrative data. So when someone gets a green card, then that information is collected and the Department of Homeland Security makes it available to the public. There's some suppression. So for example, in previous years, groups whose numbers were under 4, that data were suppressed. In more recent years, it's under 10. So if you had let's say that someone came in from Nepal and they moved to Brooklyn, if only 9, they wouldn't show up in the data. That would be suppressed. But with ACS data, that's survey data, and so that's subject to margin of error, but there's nothing where we cross-check the accuracy of the data. And we just work under the assumption that it's correct with the limitations that are inherent with the data. But I'm not quite sure if your question is if DHS is reporting these numbers accurately. Is that what you're trying to determine? Andrea?
Yeah, what I'm wondering is, with the delays now in data collection and the various sources that the American Community Survey, which seems to be much more of a hands-on household approach as opposed to the data that's collected via the forms, but the registration of the people who are seeking documentation. I'm wondering whether there's a margin of error, yes. How accurate do you find these numbers that are being reported? And do you think that they're actually, now with all the delays that you spoke about in getting any information, do you think there are other ways to go about getting this data?
There are no other sources of LPR data. There is a delay, but there's no there's nothing to suggest that the data are inaccurate. So there's no margin of error with LPR data. It's just administrative data that they record, and we just get raw numbers with some suppression based on the size. So it's not a sample of the population like ACS data. It's just what was recorded, and then they release it. The processing, so there's a difference between the lags in processing green card admissions versus when they're releasing the data. So when we get the data, it's just a single snapshot of what was for that year. So let's say that 1,000 people came in 2024. We get those totals if status were adjusted. So on the national level, they adjust the status and they may update the number and say, okay, actually 1,004 people came in, and they retroactively adjust it. So think of them as vintages that can be changed each year. But the data that we get on the county level, it's just a single snapshot. It's not adjusted. So there's a difference. I just want to clarify, there's a difference between the administrative delays with processing visas versus the delay of DHS releasing it to us. Those are completely different things. I do have faith in the data that they're releasing, the administrative data. There's nothing to suggest that the data are wrong, but it doesn't always give you the full picture of who's here based on the lag of backlog processing it, as well as some of the suppression of the data. And the American Community Survey is based on self-reported data, and then the Census Bureau disseminates that data to the public. And they include a margin of error so that we understand that there's sampling error with any type of survey data. Does that answer your question? And also there's no other source of LPR data that we can look at. And also, I just want to go back here to give you, I know I breezed through, but let's go here. Just to give you another sneak peek, these are the types of charts that are in the newest New Yorkers. They're not all stacked bar charts, but we have other interactive charts. And so when you see the book online, you'll get additional information you can see the numbers behind the data, so not just the charts. And with our tables, you're able to sort many of them. So it allows you to interact and to dive a little bit deeper into the data versus just reading a static book where you won't always have the totals the totals on the charts, are not always shown due to space limitations. Look for this when it's published later this year. And of course, we'll have a print version out. Thank you. Have a great week.